My three children cornered me on my 70th birthday, not with a cake, but with an eviction notice from my own life. They screamed in my face, calling me a useless old man because I refused to sell my home to fund their luxury lifestyles. They threw me out into the freezing rain thinking I was just a broke retired plumber with nothing left to offer. I walked away without shedding a single tear. Months later, when their fake empires started to crumble, they begged me to come back. But when those doors finally opened and they saw who I really was, the color drained from their faces. They realized they had just thrown away $25 million. Before I tell you how I brought their arrogant worlds crashing down, let me know what city or state you are listening from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that ungrateful children always get exactly what they deserve. I am Roland Pierce. For 40 years, I crawled under the houses of Atlanta, fixing busted pipes, breathing in dust and unclogging drains so my three kids could walk across college graduation stages in clean, expensive shoes. I built my life with my bare hands and a toolbox. I loved my wife, Vivian, with every breath in my body until the day cancer took her from me. After she passed, I poured all my remaining love into our children. Terrence, the oldest, Naya, the middle child, and Malik, my youngest. I thought I had raised a family bound by love and respect. I was wrong. I raised 3 sharks. It was a Friday evening, the exact day of my 70th birthday. Terrence had invited me over to his sprawling house in the upscale neighborhood of Buckhead. I wore my best suit, a navy blue number that Vivian had bought for me years ago for our anniversary. I drove my old truck up his long, winding driveway, feeling a warmth in my chest. I walked up to the heavy double doors expecting the smell of roasted chicken, maybe a birthday cake, maybe some laughter from my grandchildren. I thought this was going to be a celebration of my life. Instead, I walked into an ambush. There were no balloons. There was no food on the massive marble kitchen island. There was no music playing in the background, just a cold, suffocating silence. Terrence stood by the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. Nia was sitting on the leather sofa, scrolling on her phone. Malik was pacing back and forth, looking nervous but determined. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was Terrence's white wife. From the day they started dating, she made it very clear that she looked down on me. My rough, calloused hands and working-class grammar did not fit into her polished high society aesthetic. She was an influencer who cared more about the brand of her shoes than the content of her character. She was standing by the fireplace, swirling a glass of expensive red wine, looking at me with that same cold, calculating stare she always had. Without even saying happy birthday or offering me a glass of water, Chloe slapped 3 thick manila folders down on the glass coffee table. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a gunshot. "Look at these, Roland," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement and impatience. 3 beautiful properties, one in Alpharetta for Terrence and me, a luxury townhome for Nia, and a downtown loft for Malik. Each one is exactly $500,000. We have found the perfect homes to elevate our lifestyles. Now it is time for you to do your part. I stood there by the doorway, my hands still holding the handles of the small leather duffel bag I had brought, hoping to stay the weekend. I looked at the folders, then at the faces of my 3 children. They were staring at me like hungry wolves waiting for a piece of meat to be thrown their way. "My part?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. "What part is that, Chloe?" Terrence stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He could not even look me in the eye at first. "We need the down payments, Dad. All 3 of us are ready to close on these properties, but the market is tight. We did the math. If you sell that old rundown house of yours in the city and empty out your union retirement fund, it will easily cover the 20% down for all 3 properties. It is the only logical step for this family." I felt the air get sucked right out of my lungs. They were not asking for a favor. They were demanding my entire life as work. The sheer audacity of the request paralyzed me for a moment. "You want me to sell my home?" I asked, looking directly at Terrence. "The home where your mother and I raised you. The home where Vivian took her last breath in my arms. The home I paid off with sweat and blood. Where exactly am I supposed to live, Terrence?" Nia, who always carried a designer bag she could barely afford, finally put her phone down and rolled her eyes. "You can rent a small senior apartment somewhere, Dad. Or find a cheap room in a shared facility. You are 70 years old. You do not need 3 bedrooms and a big yard. You are just hoarding space. We are trying to build our wealth, and you are sitting on cash that could help us level up. You do not even do anything all day anyway." Malik, the youngest, the one I bailed out of trouble more times than I could count, chimed in from the corner. "Come on, old man, do not be selfish. You already lived your life. You had your time. It is our turn now. We need this to look good for our careers. You owe us this much." I stood there looking at the faces of the children I had sacrificed my back and my knees for. The children I had gone hungry for so they could eat. Selfish, I whispered the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. I paid for your college degrees. I paid for your weddings. I paid your debts when you messed up. I gave you everything I had. And now on my 70th birthday, you want to put me out on the street so you can take Instagram photos in bigger houses. I straightened my back, feeling the exhaustion of my 70 years, but refusing to let them see me break. "I am not selling the house," I said firmly, my voice echoing through their hollow mansion. "That house is the last piece of Vivian I have left. I am not trading your mother is memory so you can upgrade your zip codes. My retirement money is mine. The answer is no." Chloe is face twisted with pure disgust. The mask of the polite daughter-in-law fell off completely. With a sharp, violent flick of her wrist, she hurled her glass of red wine straight down onto the pristine white rug right near my feet, splashing the dark red liquid all over the bottom of my dress pants and my polished shoes. "This is exactly what I told you, Terrence," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "He is useless. A stubborn, useless old man who cares more about a rotting pile of wood than his own family, his future. Why do we even bother talking to him? He is nothing but a broke plumber holding us back." I looked at Terrence, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to tell his wife to calm down and respect his father. But Terrence did not defend me. Instead, he pointed a shaking, angry finger right at my face. "Why do you even keep that rat trap?" he shouted, his face turning red with rage. "You are not helping us. You are completely useless to our future. If you are not going to support this family financially, then what good are you? A useless old man like you, just get lost. Get out of my house right now." I looked at Nia. "Just go." "Dad," she said, crossing her arms and looking at me like I was a piece of trash left on the sidewalk. "You are embarrassing yourself." I looked at Malik. "Do not bother calling us until you are ready to sign the property papers," Malik added, turning his back on me and walking toward the kitchen. Outside, a heavy thunderstorm was battering the windows. Lightning flashed across the sky, casting long, dark shadows into the room. The sound of the thunder matched the heavy pounding in my chest. I looked at Terrence. I looked at Nia. I looked at Malik. And finally I looked at Chloe, who was smirking, thinking she had just won the ultimate victory. I did not yell. I did not curse at them. I did not cry. When your heart breaks completely, it does not make a sound. It just goes cold. A deep, freezing cold that numbs all the pain and leaves behind nothing but pure, sharp clarity. I picked up my old leather duffel bag. I did not say a single word to any of them. I turned around, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the freezing, pouring rain. The door slammed shut behind me, the lock clicking heavily into place. They thought they had just punished a poor, helpless old man. They thought they had discarded a heavy burden that was keeping them from their dreams. But as I stood in the driveway, letting the cold rain wash the wine off my shoes, looking back at their brightly lit mansion, I realized something. They had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of their pathetic lives. Because Roland Pierce was not a broke plumber, and I was about to teach them a lesson they would never survive. The freezing rain soaked through my cheap navy suit, but I did not feel the cold. I stood at the end of Terrence's driveway, watching the lights of his massive house blur through the downpour. They had locked the door. They had thrown me away like a broken pipe fitting. For 40 years I had defined myself as a father. I thought my greatest achievement was raising 3 successful children. But as I stood there in the dark, the father in me died. The man who replaced him was someone they had never met. Someone who knew exactly how the world worked. I reached into the pocket of my soaked jacket. I did not pull out a cheap prepaid flip phone. I pulled out a top-of-the-line, secure smartphone. I wiped the water from the screen and dialed a number I had kept on speed dial for 15 years. It rang only twice before a crisp voice answered. I told Vernon to come pick me up. I gave him the address in Buckhead and told him to hurry. Vernon did not ask questions. He was not just my lawyer. He was my wealth manager, my confidant, and the only person in Atlanta who knew the real Roland Pierce. I waited under the shadow of a large oak tree. 10 minutes later, the sleek headlights of a jet-black Maybach cut through the heavy rain. The luxury vehicle glided silently to a stop right in front of me. The driver, wearing a dark suit and a chauffeur cap, stepped out immediately with a large umbrella shielding me from the storm. He opened the heavy rear door, and I slid into the warm leather interior. The contrast was jarring. One minute I was a discarded old man in the rain, and the next I was surrounded by handcrafted leather, ambient lighting, and absolute power. Vernon was sitting in the seat next to me. He was a sharp man in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed. He looked at my soaked suit and the red wine stains on my shoes. He asked me what happened. He asked if I had given them the news. I looked out the tinted window at Terrence's house fading into the distance. I told Vernon there was no news to give. I told him my children had made their choice. My children thought I was just a retired plumber barely scraping by on a union pension. They thought the old house I lived in was my only asset. They did not know about the year 1980. Back then, the downtown warehouse district was a ghost town. Nobody wanted those rotting brick buildings. But I saw potential. I worked 80-hour weeks fixing pipes in the wealthiest homes in Atlanta, and I took every extra dollar I earned and quietly bought up a massive block of abandoned warehouses. For decades, I just sat on them, letting them gather dust while the city grew around them. Then the tech boom hit Atlanta. Corporate developers started buying up everything in sight. 6 months ago, a massive technology conglomerate approached Vernon. They needed my exact block of warehouses to build their new regional headquarters. I played hardball. I made them sweat. Last week, the deal finally closed. They wired $25 million in pure, untaxed cash right into my secure trust accounts. $25 million. That was the real reason I went to Terrence's house tonight. Inside my old battered leather duffel bag, hidden under a change of clothes, I had 3 pristine envelopes. Each envelope contained the paperwork for a trust fund holding $5 million. I was going to hand my children $5 million each on my 70th birthday. I was going to secure their futures, their children's futures, and generations to come. I wanted to see the joy on their faces. I wanted to celebrate our family. But they could not even wait for me to sit down. They were so blinded by greed, so desperate to squeeze a few $100,000 out of my old house that they threw away a $25 million empire. They called me useless. They told me to get lost. I turned to Vernon and gave him my new instructions. I told him to cancel the trusts immediately. I told him to freeze every single hidden account and to put maximum security protocols on all my assets. Vernon nodded, typing rapidly on his tablet. He asked me where I wanted to go. He knew I could not go back to the old house. If they were desperate enough to kick me out in the rain, they were desperate enough to show up at my front door, harassing me for the deed. I told Vernon to take me to the penthouse. 5 years ago, I had quietly purchased a luxury penthouse on the top floor of a high-rise in Midtown Atlanta. I bought it through a shell corporation. My children had no idea it existed. I originally bought it as a quiet investment property, but now it was going to be my fortress. The Maybach navigated the slick city streets, and soon we pulled into the private underground garage of the high-rise. We took the secure private elevator straight to the top floor. When the doors opened, I stepped into a massive modern living space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline glowing against the stormy night. The floors were polished dark wood. The furniture was sleek and expensive. This was the home of a king, not a useless old man. I walked over to the massive glass window and looked down at the city. My wet clothes were clinging to my skin, but the cold rage inside me kept me perfectly focused. Vernon stood behind me, waiting for my next command. I asked Vernon to run a full background check on my 3 children and my daughter-in-law. I told him I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know their bank balances, their credit scores, their hidden debts, and their corporate standings. If they were desperate enough to demand my house to cover a down payment, then they were hiding something massive. Happy, successful people do not ambush their father on his birthday. Desperate people do. I told Vernon that the time for unconditional love was over. For years, I had been their safety net. I paid for the expensive dinners they put on their credit cards by quietly transferring money into their accounts. I used my anonymous corporate entities to invest in Terrence's company to keep him looking like a star. I manipulated the background to make sure my children never had to struggle the way I did. I thought I was protecting them. Instead, I created entitled monsters who viewed me as nothing but a decaying ATM. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass. The 70-year-old plumber was gone. I told Vernon that starting tonight we were initiating a complete purge. I wanted every invisible safety net cut. I wanted every string I had been pulling behind the scenes dropped immediately. I was going to let them fall. But I was not just going to let them fall. I was going to find out exactly what kind of financial holes they had dug for themselves. And then I was going to make sure those holes swallowed them whole. They wanted to play high society real estate moguls. They wanted to cast me out because I did not fit into their shiny fake worlds. Now they were going to learn what real power looked like. Vernon agreed without hesitation. He promised to have a team of private investigators working through the night. He said we would have complete financial dossiers on Terrence, Nia, Malik, and Chloe by tomorrow afternoon. He poured me a glass of aged bourbon, handed it to me, and left the penthouse to execute my orders. I stood alone in the quiet luxury of my secret home. I took a sip of the bourbon, letting the familiar burn warm my chest. I looked down at my shoes, still stained with the red wine Chloe had thrown at me. She thought she was humiliating a helpless old man. Terrence thought he was showing strength by kicking me out. They thought they had won. But the game had not even started yet. I was Roland Pierce. I had survived poverty, discrimination, and 40 years of backbreaking labor. I knew how to build things from the ground up. And more importantly, I knew exactly how to tear them down piece by piece. The purge had begun, and there would be no mercy. I woke up the next morning not to the sound of dripping pipes or the creak of old floorboards, but to the silent hum of central air conditioning in my luxury penthouse. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the sprawling city of Atlanta. The heavy rainstorm from the night before had passed, leaving the morning sky clear and bright. But the storm inside my chest was just gathering its true strength. I walked over to the sleek marble kitchen island and made myself a cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream. I needed the bitter taste. I needed to stay sharp. I sat at the long dining table and played the events of last night over and over in my head. Something was deeply wrong. Terrence makes a low six-figure salary as a director. Nia owns a beauty salon downtown. Malik is a day trader who is always bragging about his cryptocurrency wallets. On paper, my children were supposed to be the picture of modern black excellence. So why would three supposedly rich adults practically hold a knife to their 70-year-old father's throat for a house down payment? Truly successful people do not act like cornered animals. They do not demand an old man empty his union pension and sell his only shelter unless they are drowning. And I needed to know exactly what kind of dark water my children were drowning in. At exactly 10 in the morning, the private elevator chimed. The doors slid open, and my lawyer, Vernon, stepped out. Walking right behind him was a man I had known for many years but hoped I would never actually need to use. His name was Jackson. Jackson was a former federal fraud investigator who now ran the most ruthless and discreet private intelligence firm in the state of Georgia. If you had a dirty secret hidden in your closet, Jackson would not just find it, he would tell you exactly what brand of clothes it died in. Jackson did not smile. He did not offer any warm greetings. He simply walked up into my dining table and dropped a stack of thick, heavy manila folders right in front of me. Jackson looked at me and sighed. He said, "Roland, your kids are not just broke, they are absolutely radioactive." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the heat burn the back of my throat. I told Jackson to start talking. I told him to start with my oldest son. I wanted to hear everything there was to know about Terrence and his beautiful, perfect wife, Chloe. On the surface, Terrence was the golden boy of the Pierce family. He was the regional sales director for a massive medical supply company. He wore $3,000 custom suits. He drove a leased black Porsche. He always made sure everyone in the room knew exactly how important he was. And his wife, Chloe, was even worse. Chloe was a social media influencer. She spent her days recording videos in her pristine kitchen, showing off designer handbags, imported skincare routines, and her supposedly flawless luxury lifestyle. She had hundreds of thousands of followers who believed she was a queen of high society. To her followers, Chloe was an icon of wealth. But to me, she was just the cruel woman who threw a glass of red wine on my shoes and called me a useless old man. For years, they had both gone out of their way to make me feel small. They made me feel like the dirt under my fingernails from 40 years of plumbing was a disease. They treated my humble, quiet life as a source of deep embarrassment. They wanted the world to believe they were untouchable elites. But as Jackson opened the first folder, the illusion shattered into a million sharp, dirty pieces. Jackson slid a thick bank statement across the table. The pages were covered in red ink. Terrence and Chloe were not rich at all. They were living inside a massive financial black hole. Jackson explained that Chloe's entire influencer career was a complete fabrication. She was not getting paid for any brand deals. She was buying all those luxury bags, shoes, and vacations on credit just to pretend she was sponsored. She had maxed out 12 different premium credit cards. The Porsche that Terrence drove so proudly around Buckhead was 3 months behind on payments. The bank had already issued a repossession order. They were drowning in over $400,000 of high-interest consumer debt. I stared at the numbers on the page, feeling a mix of disgust and sorrow. But Jackson shook his head and told me that the credit card debt was not even the worst part. That was just the warm-up. I asked Jackson the one question that had been burning in my mind. I asked him why they needed my house money right now. Why did they ambush me on my 70th birthday with real estate brochures? Jackson pulled out a confidential corporate document and pushed it toward me. My blood ran completely cold as I read the words on the paper. Terrence had not been making his sales quotas for over a year and a half. To keep up with Chloe's insane spending habits and to keep his fake rich lifestyle afloat. Terrence had started playing with the company books. He had been falsifying supply invoices and routing client payments into a ghost account set up in his own name. My son, the boy I worked overtime to send to a private university, had embezzled $300,000 from his own employer. Jackson looked me dead in the eye. He said, "Roland, the company auditors caught the discrepancy 2 weeks ago. They confronted Terrence with the evidence. Because he was a senior director, they did not call the police immediately. They wanted to avoid a massive public relations scandal. So they gave him a quiet ultimatum. They gave him exactly 30 days to return the stolen $300,000. If he fails to wire the money by the end of the month, the company is handing the entire file over to the FBI. Terrence is currently facing 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement." Suddenly, the horrible ambush at the birthday party made perfect, sickening sense. They did not want my house money to buy a beautiful new home in Alpharetta. Those real estate brochures Chloe slapped on the table were nothing but cheap props. It was a smokescreen. They needed me to sell my property and hand them cash so they could secretly pay back the stolen corporate funds and keep Terrence out of a federal prison cell. They were not trying to level up their lifestyle. They were desperately trying to buy their way out of a felony conviction. And they were perfectly willing to leave their 70-year-old father homeless sleeping on a park bench just to save their own skin. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. The anger I felt the night before evolved into something much colder and much darker. My own flesh and blood had become a common thief. And instead of coming to me like a man, instead of admitting his catastrophic mistakes and asking for his help, he tried to bully me. He let his entitled, racist wife scream in my face. They tried to guilt-trip me into sacrificing my basic survival to cover up his federal crimes. Vernon placed a hand on the table and asked me what I wanted to do. He told me we could anonymously report the missing funds to the authorities right now and watch Terrence get arrested in handcuffs by sunset. But I slowly shook my head. I looked at Vernon and told him that going to prison right now was far too easy. Going to prison would just make Terrence a victim in Chloe's eyes. They would spin the story. They would blame me for not helping them. If I pulled the trigger now, they would hate me for the rest of their miserable lives without ever learning a lesson. Number 1, I wanted them to feel the exact same helplessness they tried to force on me. I wanted them to watch their fake empire crumble brick by fake brick while they scrambled in the dirt. I wanted Chloe to look at her phone and realize her internet followers could not save her from total bankruptcy. I told Jackson to leave Terrence's file on the table and keep digging. We had unmasked the golden boy, but I had 2 more children who threw me out into the freezing rain. I needed to know exactly what kind of poison was running through Nia and Malik before I began my real work. Jackson slid another thick folder across the smooth marble surface of my dining table. He told me to look closely at the highlighted bank statements inside. I opened the file and my eyes scanned the pages. The numbers printed on those sheets of paper made my stomach turn into tight, painful knots. Chloe was not just spending money. She was burning it faster than oxygen. I saw a charge for $10,000 at a designer boutique in a single afternoon. I saw $5,000 spent on exclusive skin treatments. I saw $30,000 wired to a luxury resort in Dubai just so she could take pictures for her internet followers. She was obsessed with projecting the image of a wealthy elite woman. She wanted the entire world to believe she was born into high society. She walked around Atlanta looking down on working-class people like me. She treated my calloused hands like they were a disease. But the truth written on those bank statements was that her entire life was a pathetic lie. She was draining my son dry. And Terrence, instead of acting like a real man and telling his spoiled wife no, decided to become a common thief to keep her happy. He was terrified of losing his shiny white trophy wife. He was terrified she would leave him if the stolen money stopped flowing. Terrence worked as a regional sales director for a major medical supply company. He had unrestricted access to corporate expense accounts and vendor payment systems. Jackson explained exactly how my golden boy committed his crimes. Terrence created fake vendor invoices for medical supplies that were never ordered and never delivered. He routed those corporate payments into a dummy corporation registered in Delaware. From that shadow company, the money flowed directly into a private checking account controlled entirely by Chloe. $300,000 stolen over the course of 18 months. Every single time Chloe recorded a video unboxing a new designer handbag on the internet, she was holding stolen corporate funds. Every time she posted a picture sipping champagne on a yacht, she was drinking away Terrence's freedom. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were smarter than everyone else. But corporate auditors are not stupid. They noticed the financial bleeding. They tracked the fake invoices back to the Delaware company. They cornered Terrence in a glass boardroom 2 weeks before my 70th birthday. They laid out all the evidence on the table. They told him they had him dead to rights. The medical supply company did not want the bad press of a senior director going to federal prison. A public scandal would ruin their stock prices. So they offered Terrence a quiet deal. They gave him a strict ultimatum. Return the $300,000 within 30 days, and they would simply fire him quietly and sweep the entire mess under the rug. But if he failed to return the money by the deadline, they would hand the entire mountain of evidence over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The clock was ticking. The walls were closing in on them. Terrence was desperate. But here is the most sinister and disgusting part of their entire plan. The real estate folders they threw in my face at the birthday party. The luxury house in Alpharetta they demanded I pay for. They did not just want to pay back the medical company. They wanted me to cash out my union pension and sell my home for $600,000. They planned to use half of my money to pay off the corporate auditors and keep Terrence out of handcuffs, and they planned to use the other half to buy a brand new luxury house entirely in Chloe's name. Jackson explained the legal loophole to me. If the new house was registered in Chloe's name alone, it would be completely shielded from any future lawsuits or bankruptcy claims against Terrence. They were trying to launder my hard-earned money to save their own skin and protect their fake wealthy lifestyle. They wanted to strip me of everything I had built over 40 years of crawling under dirty houses and fixing broken pipes just so Chloe could keep her massive walk-in closet and Terrence could avoid wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. My own son was willing to throw me into the freezing rain and leave me to die in a cheap senior shelter. He looked me right in the eye and called me a useless old man, all while knowing he was a desperate federal criminal begging for a secret bailout. He pointed his finger at me and told me to get lost because I refused to be the sacrificial lamb for his pathetic mistakes. The utter lack of respect, the sheer breathtaking arrogance. It was not just a family betrayal. It was pure, unfiltered evil. Looking back at the birthday party, everything suddenly made perfect sense. When Chloe threw that glass of red wine on my shoes, she was not acting out of superiority. She was acting out of pure, blinding terror. She knew her fake empire was collapsing. She knew the designer clothes and the luxury cars were about to be stripped away. Her anger was just masked panic. And when Terrence screamed in my face, he was projecting his own massive failures onto me. He was a coward who could not face the consequences of his own actions. He needed someone to blame for the nightmare he created. And he chose the man who gave him life. He chose the father who sacrificed everything to build his foundation. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the massive windows of my penthouse. The morning sun was reflecting off the glass buildings of downtown Atlanta. I thought about all the overtime hours I worked when Terrence was a little boy. I thought about how Vivian and I skipped meals just so we could afford to buy him new school clothes. We gave him every advantage we never had. We taught him the value of an honest dollar. and he threw it all away to impress a woman who did not even respect his own father. I felt a cold, sharp smile form on my face. A deep sense of absolute clarity washed over me. I looked at Vernon and Jackson sitting across from me. Vernon asked if I wanted him to make an anonymous phone call to the FBI right now. He said we could have federal agents kicking down Terrence's door before lunchtime. I slowly shook my head. I told Vernon that calling the authorities right now was far too easy. Going to prison today would just make Terrence a martyr in Chloe's eyes. They would spin the story to their friends. They would blame me for not helping them in their time of need. If I pulled the trigger now, they would hate me for the rest of their miserable lives without ever truly understanding the depth of their own failures. Number one, I wanted them to feel the exact same helplessness they tried to force on me. I wanted them to watch their fake empire crumble brick by fake brick while they scrambled in the dirt. The 30-day window the company gave him was the perfect weapon. I was going to let Terrence sweat. I was going to let him feel the seconds ticking away until his life completely imploded. I wanted Chloe to wake up every morning in a cold panic, knowing that her luxury life was built on a ticking time bomb. I told Jackson to close Terrence's file and leave it on the table. We had unmasked the golden boy. We had exposed the fake influencer. But I had 2 more children who stood by and watched me get thrown out into the rain. I had 2 more children who demanded my house money and called me a burden. I needed to know exactly what kind of poison was running through Nia and Malik before I began my real work. I looked at Jackson and told him to open the next folder. I told him I was ready to see what my beautiful, successful daughter was hiding behind her perfect smile. Jackson reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the second folder. This one was surprisingly thick, bulging with official-looking government documents. He slid it across the cool marble table right into my line of sight. I looked at the label printed on the tab. It had my only daughter's name on it, Nia. I took a deep breath and prepared myself. Nia was the middle child. Out of all my kids, she was the one who always wore her pride like a crown. She owned 3 upscale beauty salons right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. She drove a pristine white Range Rover. She wore imported silk outfits and carried bags that cost more than my first truck. Nia branded herself as the ultimate independent boss lady. She loved giving speeches at family dinners about how she built her empire from the ground up without relying on anyone. She loved to remind me that my generation was stuck in the past working for hourly wages while she was creating generational wealth. At my birthday party, she had sat on that leather sofa, scrolling through her phone, looking completely bored by my existence. She was the one who told me to go rent a room in a cheap shared facility. She looked at me like I was an expired coupon. A useless old man taking up too much space in her shiny modern world. I opened the folder. The very first page was a final notice from the Internal Revenue Service. It was stamped with bold red ink. I looked up at Jackson. He did not say a word. He just nodded and motioned for me to keep reading. I turned the pages, and the illusion of my successful independent daughter dissolved into a nightmare of federal tax fraud. Nia had not built an empire. She had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of stolen government money. Jackson began to lay out the ugly truth. He told me that Nia had not paid a single dime in federal or state income taxes in 5 long years. But it was much worse than just ignoring her own taxes. She had been deducting payroll taxes from her dozens of employees every single week, and instead of sending that money to the government, she was dropping it straight into her own personal bank accounts to fund her extravagant lifestyle. She was stealing from her own stylists and stealing from the federal government to pay for her Range Rover and her designer shoes. The IRS does not play games, Jackson explained, his voice flat and serious. They have been auditing her businesses for the last 8 months. Nia ignored all their warnings. She thought she could outsmart the federal government. But 2 weeks ago, the IRS dropped the hammer. They sent her a final notice of intent to levy. They are preparing to freeze every single business and personal bank account attached to her name. They are going to padlock the doors to all 3 of her salons and auction off every piece of equipment she owns. She owes the government over $500,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest. And if she does not produce the cash immediately, she is not just losing her business. She is looking at severe criminal charges for tax evasion. I sat there staring at the federal warrants, feeling a sickening wave of betrayal wash over me. My daughter was a criminal, a fraud, and just like Terrence, she was a coward hiding behind a facade of luxury. But then the pieces of the puzzle started snapping together in my mind, the birthday ambush. The real estate folders. I looked at Vernon and asked the obvious question. If the IRS is about to seize everything she owns, why in the world was she trying to buy a brand new luxury townhome for $500,000? How could she even get approved for a mortgage with the federal government breathing down her neck? Vernon leaned forward, his eyes sharp and calculating. He told me she was not getting a mortgage, Roland. She could not get a loan from a legitimate bank if her life depended on it. Her credit is completely destroyed. That is exactly why she needed your money. She needed you to sell your house and drain your pension to buy that townhome in cash. Jackson tapped the folder. She did not want to live in that townhome, Roland. She needed a clean, untainted asset. If you bought that property and put the deed in her name, she was going to turn right around and use it as collateral. She has been in contact with a group of predatory private lenders, black market loan sharks who do not care about IRS liens, as long as they have a clean piece of real estate to hold over your head. Nia was going to leverage the house you bought her to secure a massive high-interest cash loan from the streets. She planned to take that dirty money and hand it over to the IRS to keep herself out of federal prison. The sheer scale of her selfishness made my chest physically ache. Nia wanted me to surrender the home where I raised her, the home where her mother died, just so she could hand it over to black market loan sharks. She was perfectly willing to let me rot in a cheap senior shelter while she gambled away my life savings to cover up her 5 years of tax fraud. She called me a useless old man because I refused to be the human shield for her federal crimes. She rolled her eyes and told me to get lost because I was standing between her and a get-out-of-jail-free card. I thought about the way she looked at me that night, the absolute lack of empathy. The pure, unadulterated entitlement. She had convinced herself that because I was old and wore work boots my entire life, I existed solely to be consumed. My blood, my sweat, my union pension, it was all just fuel for her to burn. Vernon asked me if I wanted to intervene. He pointed out that if the IRS seized her salons, she would have absolutely nothing left. She would be completely ruined. He said we could easily pay the tax bill right now with a tiny fraction of the $25 million sitting in my trust account. We could wipe her slate clean before the federal agents arrived. I looked down at the IRS levy notices. I saw the arrogant face of my daughter in my mind. I saw her crossing her arms and telling me I was hoarding space. I saw her standing by while Chloe threw wine on my shoes. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I told Vernon that Nia loved to brag about being an independent boss. She loved to tell the world that she built her empire all by herself. So I was going to let her defend it all by herself. If I paid off the IRS, she would just go back to pretending she was royalty. She would never face the consequences of stealing from her own employees. She would never understand the pain of losing everything you worked for. I told Jackson to monitor the situation closely. I wanted to know the exact moment the federal agents showed up at her salons with the padlocks. I wanted to know when they towed away her pristine white Range Rover. She thought she was too good for my old house. She thought my life was worthless compared to her shiny modern existence. Now she was going to find out what it really meant to be broke, desperate, and completely alone. My daughter had made her bed with lies and stolen tax money, and now the federal government was coming to tuck her in. I was not going to lift a single finger to stop them. I took a deep breath and looked at the last folder sitting on the table. Terrence was a corporate embezzler. Nia was a federal tax cheat. 2 of my children were already sinking in deep, dark water. I turned my attention to Jackson and told him to open the final file. I needed to know what my youngest son, my supposedly righteous boy Malik, was hiding in the shadows. Jackson placed the 3rd and final folder on the marble table. It felt heavier than the other 2. The name on the tab was Malik, my youngest son, the boy I had to bail out of trouble more times than I could count when he was a teenager. But as an adult, Malik had completely rebranded himself. He was the religious one. He never missed a Sunday service. He wore tailored suits and carried a leather-bound Bible. He loved to preach about morality and discipline at family dinners. He looked down on anyone who did not meet his strict righteous standards. At my birthday ambush, Malik was the one who stood in the corner and told me I had already lived my life. He told me it was their turn now. He told me not to bother calling them until I was ready to sign the property papers. He spoke to me with the cold authority of a judge handing down a sentence. He made it seem like demanding my life savings was some sort of divine right. I told Jackson to open the file. I braced myself for whatever hypocrisy my youngest son was hiding. Jackson did not show me corporate documents or tax notices this time. He pulled out a stack of encrypted digital transaction logs and blurry surveillance photographs. He told me that Malik was not a successful day trader. He was a degenerate gambling addict hiding behind the modern disguise of cryptocurrency. Malik had convinced himself he was a financial genius. He spent his days placing massive high-risk trades on unregulated offshore exchanges. When the crypto market took a massive dive last year, Malik lost everything. His savings, his investments, his retirement accounts all wiped out in a matter of days. But Malik could not accept defeat. He wanted to win it all back. Since no legitimate bank would lend him money to gamble on digital coins, he turned to the darkest corners of Atlanta. Jackson explained that Malik had borrowed heavily from a violent street syndicate operating out of the West End. These were not men who wore suits or cared about credit scores. They were ruthless predators. Malik borrowed $200,000 in dirty street money. He dumped every single penny back into the crypto market, hoping for a miracle bounce, and he lost it all again. Jackson slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Malik's expensive luxury sedan parked outside his apartment. Every single window was shattered. The tires were slashed. The leather seats were completely destroyed. Jackson told me that the syndicate does not send politely worded warning letters. They send enforcers in the middle of the night. That broken car was their first and only warning. Malik owed them $200,000, and the deadline was the end of the month. The gang made it absolutely clear that if he did not produce the cash, they were not going to break his legs. They were going to put him in a shallow grave. My hands gripped the edge of the table. My youngest son, the righteous church boy, was literally begging for his life in the criminal underworld. Suddenly, the third real estate folder from the birthday party made perfect, sickening sense. The downtown loft that Malik demanded I buy for him, it was listed at exactly $500,000. Malik did not want to live in that loft. He needed me to buy it in pure cash, so he could immediately sign the deed over to the syndicate boss. He was going to use the home I bought with my blood and sweat to wipe his street debt clean. He was going to trade his 70-year-old father as survival to save himself from getting a bullet in the head. I sat back in my chair. The penthouse was completely silent except for the faint sound of the city traffic hundreds of feet below. I looked down at the smooth marble dining table. The 3 thick manila folders were spread out in front of me. Terrence, Nia, Malik. I stared at the files and felt a profound, chilling shift deep inside my soul. For weeks I had been carrying the heavy burden of a rejected father. I thought my children had cast me out because I was just not good enough for their high society world. I thought they despised me because my hands were rough and my clothes were plain. I thought their arrogance was born from their massive success. But as I looked at the evidence of their crimes, the entire picture flipped upside down. My 3 beautiful, successful children were nothing but desperate frauds. Terrence was a corporate embezzler facing federal prison. Nia was a tax cheat about to have her entire life seized by the government. Malik was a degenerate gambler marked for death by a street gang. The cruel ambush at my birthday party was not a display of power. It was the frantic thrashing of 3 people drowning in the deep end of the ocean. Their arrogance was nothing but a fragile mask covering up their sheer blinding panic. They were completely backed into a corner by their own greed and stupidity. They saw the walls closing in on them. They heard the ticking clocks of their own destruction. And in their absolute desperation, they turned to the only person who had always saved them, me. But they were too proud to ask for help. They were too deeply invested in their fake elite personas to admit they were catastrophic failures. So instead of begging their father for mercy, they decided to bully me. They tried to terrorize an old man into handing over his life savings. They threw me out into the freezing rain, hoping the cold and the fear would break my spirit. They thought if they treated me like garbage, I would eventually crawl back and hand them the keys to my house just to buy back their fake love. They did not kick me out because I was useless. They kicked me out because I was the only life raft they had left, and I refused to let them drag me under the water with them. Vernon broke the silence. He asked me how I was holding up. He said it was a lot for any father to process. He reminded me that with the $25 million sitting safely in my trust, we could wipe away all of their debts by tomorrow morning. We could pay the corporate auditors, we could pay the federal government, and we could pay the street syndicate. We could save their lives without them ever knowing where the money came from. I looked at Vernon, I looked at Jackson, and then I looked back at the 3 folders. I told them no. I told them that saving them now would be the greatest disservice I could ever do as a father. I had spent 40 years shielding them from the consequences of their actions. I had worked myself to the bone so they would never have to feel the cold bite of the real world, and my protection had turned them into entitled monsters. They were willing to sacrifice my life to save their own luxury cars and designer clothes. If I bailed them out now, they would just find deeper holes to fall into. I told Vernon to close the folders. I did not want to save them anymore. I wanted to watch them drown in the exact same cold, dark waters they tried to push me into. The investigation was over. We knew all their dirty secrets. We knew exactly where they were vulnerable. Now it was time to let the trap snap shut. I was going to sit high up in my luxury penthouse and watch the corporate auditors, the federal agents, and the street thugs tear their fake empires to pieces. The age of the useless old man was officially over. The purge was ready to begin. 1 month had passed since I walked out of that mansion into the freezing rain. 30 days of absolute total silence. I did not answer their frantic phone calls. I did not reply to their desperate text messages. I let my old flip phone sit in a drawer in the penthouse gathering dust. From the comfort of my luxury high-rise, I watched the days tick by. I knew exactly what was happening out there in the real world. The walls were closing in on them. Terrence was reaching the end of his 30-day grace period with the corporate auditors. Nia was constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the federal agents to padlock her salons. Malik was jumping at every shadow, terrified that the street syndicate was coming to collect his blood. They were running out of time, and they were running out of options. And the one person they needed to save them, the useless old man they threw away, had vanished into thin air. They tried to find me. They tried absolutely everything. Jackson, my private investigator, sent me daily reports on their frantic search. They went to my old house in the city, but they found the doors locked and the windows dark. They knocked on the doors of my old union buddies, asking if I was sleeping on their couches. They even went to my favorite diner downtown, asking the waitresses if they had seen me. They were desperate. They needed my signature on a deed. They needed my retirement money. But I was a ghost. I sat drinking aged bourbon, looking down at the Atlanta skyline, knowing that my silence was the most powerful weapon I had ever wielded. Then came the turning point. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Jackson called me on my secure line. He told me the fish were swarming. Terrence, Nia, Malik, and Chloe had called an emergency family meeting. They did not meet at Terrence's mansion because the stress was tearing his marriage apart. They chose a high-end coffee shop in Buckhead. It was the kind of place where people wore expensive clothes and pretended to have perfect lives. But my children did not look perfect anymore. Jackson had a man sitting at the table right next to them, nursing an espresso with a high-tech directional microphone hidden inside his leather briefcase. The audio feed was beamed directly to the secure laptop sitting on my marble dining table. I put on my headphones and listened to the sound of my own flesh and blood tearing each other apart. The recording started with the sound of clinking coffee cups and heavy, nervous breathing. Then Terrence spoke. His voice was shaking. He did not sound like a hotshot sales director anymore. He sounded like a broken man. He told them he had exactly 48 hours before the corporate auditors handed his embezzlement file over to the FBI. He said he was going to lose everything. He said he was going to prison. Nia snapped right back at him. She told him his corporate problems were nothing compared to hers. She said her bank accounts had been frozen that morning by the IRS. She said she could not even pay her salon employees, and she was days away from a federal tax indictment. Then Malik chimed in. His voice was barely a whisper. He told his older siblings that the street gang had left a bullet on the driver's seat of his car the night before. He told them he was going to be murdered if he did not pay the $200,000 by Friday. I listened to their panic. They were drowning. They were suffocating under the weight of their own criminal choices. Terrence slammed his fist on the coffee shop table and cursed my name. He asked where the hell I was. He said I was doing this on purpose to punish them. He said if they could just find me, they could force me to sign the house over. He said they could corner me and make me drain my pension, but they could not find me. I was completely out of their reach. And that is when Chloe stepped in. Chloe, the pristine social media influencer, the woman who looked at me like I was a cockroach, lowered her voice. I turned up the volume on my headphones. Her words were crystal clear and they chilled me to the bone. She told them they were thinking about this all wrong. She said they did not need to find me to get my house. They just needed to erase me. Terrence asked her what she meant. Chloe laid out a plan so sinister and so purely evil that it made my stomach turn. She told them they did not need my consent if the law believed I was no longer capable of giving it. Chloe told them they had enough money left on a maxed-out credit card to hire a dirty doctor. She knew a disgraced physician who catered to desperate people. For a few $1,000s in cash, this doctor would write up a fraudulent medical evaluation stating that Roland Pierce was suffering from severe advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease. They would claim that I was suffering from extreme dementia and that I had wandered off into the city completely out of my mind. With that fake medical document in hand, they would go to a judge and file for an emergency medical power of attorney and a full legal conservatorship. They would tell the court they were terrified for my safety and needed immediate control over my assets to pay for my future medical care and private investigators to find me. Chloe explained that once they had the conservatorship signed by a judge, my signature would mean absolutely nothing. They would become the legal owners of my life. They could bypass me entirely. They could put my old house on the market as a distressed property and sell it for pure cash to a real estate investor in a matter of days. They could drain my union pension. They could wipe out my bank accounts. They would take everything I owned and use it to pay off the corporate auditors, the IRS, and the street gang. And the most terrifying part was what they planned to do when I finally showed up again. Chloe laughed a cold, wicked laugh. She said, "If the old man ever comes back, we just have him locked up in a state-run mental ward. We tell the police his claims of being robbed are just hallucinations from his dementia. Nobody will ever believe a crazy old man over his 3 successful, concerned children." I waited to hear my children object. I waited to hear Terrence say that this was going too far. I waited to hear Nia or Malik say that they could not legally erase their own father and lock him in an asylum. I waited for just one shred of human decency from the people I shared my blood with, but the objection never came. There was a moment of silence, and then Terrence let out a deep breath. He told Chloe it was brilliant. He said it was the only way out. Nia agreed immediately, saying it was my own fault for hiding from them. Malik said they needed to get the paperwork moving by tomorrow morning before the gang came looking for his blood. They all agreed. They all conspired to strip me of my human rights, my property, and my freedom. They were going to bury me alive. I sat in the quiet luxury of my penthouse, pulling the headphones off my ears. I looked at the audio file saved on my laptop. It was not just a conversation. It was a recorded confession of a major federal conspiracy to commit medical fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft. They had just handed me the weapon that would utterly destroy them. They thought they were playing a dirty game of survival. They did not realize they had just stepped onto a battlefield where I held every single advantage. I picked up my phone and called Vernon. I told him to listen to the audio file I just sent him. I told him my children had decided to play dirty. But they forgot one crucial thing. They forgot that the man they were trying to outsmart had survived the rough streets of Atlanta long before they were even born. They wanted to steal my identity. They wanted to take my house. I told Vernon it was time to let them think they had won. We were going to open the door and let the rats walk right into the trap. I sat in the quiet darkness of my penthouse, listening to the city wind beat against the thick glass windows. I had the audio file on my laptop. I had their voices clearly conspiring to erase my existence, to forge medical documents, and to declare me mentally incompetent. Any normal father would have picked up the phone and called the police right then and there. I could have had patrol cars pulling up to their driveways before midnight. I could have stopped them before they committed the actual crime. But I remembered a lesson I learned a long time ago, back when I was a young man fixing pipes in the rat-infested basements of the city. If you want to catch a rat, you do not block the hole. If you block the hole, they just scurry away and find another way into your house. If you really want to end the infestation, you have to leave the door wide open. You have to put the bait deep inside the trap and let them walk all the way in. You have to let them think they have won right up until the moment the steel bar snaps their neck. I called Vernon and told him to come back to the penthouse. When he arrived, I played the recording for him. He listened to Terrence, Nia, Malik, and Chloe plotting my legal death. I watched the color drain from Vernon's face. He was a seasoned lawyer, but even he was sickened by the sheer cold-blooded nature of my children. Vernon immediately reached for his phone. He said we needed to contact the district attorney. He told me that planning to forge a medical conservatorship was a serious conspiracy charge. He said we could freeze them in their tracks and get them arrested by tomorrow. I reached across the table and put my hand over his phone. I looked him dead in the eye and shook my head. I told Vernon that a conspiracy charge was just a warning. It was a slap on the wrist. With a good lawyer, they could spin it. They could claim they were just talking out of stress. They could claim they never actually intended to go through with it. I did not want them slipping out of a courtroom with a fine and a probation sentence. I wanted them destroyed. I wanted them to cross the point of no return. I explained my plan to Vernon. I told him we were not going to stop them. We were going to open the door and roll out the red carpet. I wanted them to take that fake doctor as note. I wanted them to walk into the Fulton County Courthouse, and I wanted them to file those forged documents on the public federal record. The moment a court clerk stamped that paper, their little coffee shop conspiracy would transform into massive federal wire fraud, identity theft, and real estate fraud. They would be looking at decades in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no way out. Vernon looked at me like I was a madman. He told me it was too risky. He said if the county judge signed the emergency conservatorship, my children would legally own my life. They would have the absolute power to sell my house, to empty my accounts, and to lock me in a psychiatric ward if I ever showed my face. I smiled a cold, hard smile. I told Vernon that power is only real if the person you are using it against does not know it is coming. I reminded him that he knew half the judges and clerks in the county. I told him to make a few quiet phone calls. I wanted him to reach out to his contacts at the probate court and the land registry office. I told him to make sure that when Terrence walked in with those fake medical papers, nobody asked any difficult questions. I wanted the clerks to wave the paperwork right through the system. I wanted the judge to sign it without a second thought. Give them the green light. Let them believe they had successfully scammed the entire legal system. Vernon hesitated for a moment, but he saw the unyielding fire in my eyes. He nodded, pulled out his phone, and started making the calls. He was going to pave the road for my children to walk straight into hell. For the next week, Jackson, my private investigator, provided me with a brilliant high-definition front-row seat to their criminal hustle. It was a masterpiece of desperation. On Wednesday, Chloe found her dirty doctor. Jackson sent me photographs of Chloe and Terrence meeting a disgraced physician in the back parking lot of a rundown strip mall. They handed him a thick envelope of cash. In exchange, the doctor handed them a perfectly forged medical evaluation. It stated in highly technical medical jargon that Roland Pierce was suffering from severe late-stage Alzheimer's disease, that I was completely detached from reality, and that I was a danger to myself and others. On Thursday morning, Terrence put on his best tailored suit. He walked into the Fulton County Courthouse with his head held high. He stood in front of a county clerk, placed his hand on a Bible, and swore an oath that his father was mentally gone. He filed the forged medical documents and submitted a petition for emergency medical and financial power of attorney. Normally, a petition like that takes weeks to verify. But Vernon had done his job perfectly. His contacts in the clerk, his office flagged the file and expedited it straight to a judge's desk without standard verification. The judge, seeing the supposedly legitimate medical evaluation, signed the emergency order. Just like that, it was done. In the eyes of the law, I was a ghost. I was a senseless old man, incapable of making my own decisions. And my son Terrence was now the legal master of my entire estate. Jackson told me they celebrated that night. They did not just breathe a sigh of relief. They threw a party. They met at a high-end steakhouse in Buckhead. Jackson sat 2 tables away and recorded the whole thing. They ordered expensive champagne, putting it on one of the fraudulent credit cards Eleanor had opened in my name. They were laughing. They were cheering. Terrence boasted about how easy it was to fool the judge. Chloe bragged about how smart her plan was. Nia talked about how the IRS was finally going to get off her back. Malik looked like a man who had just dodged a bullet from the Grim Reaper. They were euphoric. They believed their nightmare was over. They believed they had successfully sacrificed their useless father to save their own luxury lifestyles. They had absolutely no idea that every laugh, every toast, and every sip of champagne was being documented for the federal prosecutor. The very next morning, they moved in for the kill. Terrence used his new fraudulent power of attorney to list my old house on the real estate market. They did not even bother to clean the place or clear out Vivian's old belongings. They listed it as a distressed property for a quick cash sale. They priced it at $450,000. It was a massive lowball for the neighborhood, but they did not care about getting fair market value. They just needed the cash immediately. Terrence had less than a week before his corporate auditors called the FBI. Malik had days before the street syndicate came looking for his blood. They needed a buyer who could close the deal and wire the funds in record time. I was not about to let some random stranger buy the house where I raised my family. So I had Vernon set up a dummy limited liability company registered in Delaware. Within 3 hours of Terrence listing my house, Vernon submitted a full cash offer through our shadow corporation. Terrence accepted the offer instantly. He did not ask questions. He did not care who the buyer was. He just saw a corporate entity willing to wire $450,000 in pure untraceable cash. The closing date was set for the following Friday. The trap was set perfectly. The cheese was sitting right on the trigger. My children spent the next few days walking on air. They thought they had beaten the system. They thought they had buried me alive and stolen the shovel. They were already planning how to divide the money. Terrence was going to wire his stolen corporate funds back to his company. Nia was going to pay off her federal tax liens. Malik was going to hand a bag of cash to a violent street boss. And Chloe was already browsing luxury real estate listings for her new, fully shielded mansion. I sat in my penthouse looking at the signed real estate contract bearing Terrence's forged signature. He had committed the ultimate federal crime. He had sold stolen property across state lines using fraudulent medical documents. They were so incredibly arrogant. They thought because I was old, because my hands were calloused, because I did not understand their shiny social media world that I was stupid. But you do not survive the streets of Atlanta and build a $25 million empire by being stupid. You survive by being patient. You survive by letting your enemies dig their own graves so deep that they can never climb out. The closing day was approaching. They thought they were waiting for a massive payday, but they were actually just waiting for the executioner to drop the axe. And I was going to make sure that I was the one holding the handle. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully navigated the darkest chapter of their lives by stepping on my back and burying me alive in the legal system. With the fraudulent real estate contract signed and the closing date scheduled for Friday, they believed they just had to hold their breath for a few more days. They thought the money from my house would magically appear in their accounts and wash away all their sins. But I was not going to let them breathe. I was not going to let them enjoy a single second of that false victory. They wanted to play God with my life, so I decided to show them what a real Judgment Day looked like. I sat in my penthouse staring at the Atlanta skyline and picked up my secure phone. It was time to pull the strings. I was going to systematically dismantle their lives before the ink on that fake real estate contract even had a chance to dry. I started with my oldest son. Terrence thought he had an entire month to pay back the $300,000 he embezzled. He thought he had a secret gentleman, his agreement with the corporate auditors. But corporate loyalty is a myth. I instructed Jackson to compile every single piece of evidence regarding Terrence's theft. The fake vendor invoices, the shell company registrations in Delaware, and the direct wire transfers into Chloe's private checking account. But we did not send it to the auditors. We sent a heavily encrypted anonymous email directly to the chief executive officer and the entire board of directors of the medical supply company. I made sure the email explicitly stated that if the board tried to sweep this felony under the rug, the evidence would be leaked to the financial press by morning. The corporate execution was swift and merciless. Jackson had a man parked outside Terrence's glass office building to witness the fallout. At exactly 10 in the morning, 2 armed corporate security guards and the head of human resources walked right into Terrence's corner office. They did not wait for him to finish his coffee. They did not let him save files on his computer. They handed him a cardboard box and told him to empty his desk immediately. They escorted my golden boy out through the main lobby in front of his entire sales team. The humiliation was absolute. They confiscated his company phone, his keys, and his dignity. Before he even reached the parking lot, his industry contacts were notified. Terrence was not just fired, he was blacklisted. He was legally barred from the building and told that federal charges were being filed by the end of the week. When Terrence stumbled back to his mansion with his cardboard box, Chloe did not comfort him. Through the audio bugs we had placed, I listened to her scream at him. She was furious that her husband had lost his 6-figure income. She called him a failure. The walls of their fake elite marriage were cracking wide open, but I was just getting started. Next, I turned my attention to Nia, my beautiful independent daughter who loved to boast about her beauty salon empire while stealing payroll taxes from her own employees. She thought she could stall the Internal Revenue Service by promising them a lump sum payment after my house was sold. She thought the federal government would wait patiently for her dirty money. I decided to accelerate her timeline. I had Vernon send a courier directly to the lead federal investigator handling Naya's audit. Inside the package were the shadow ledgers Jackson had uncovered, showing exactly where she had hidden her assets and detailing her active attempts to secure black market loans to cover her tracks. The IRS does not take kindly to taxpayers who try to play games with shadow money. 2 days after Terrence was escorted out of his office, the federal agents descended on Nia. It was a busy Thursday afternoon. Her flagship downtown salon was packed with high-paying clients getting expensive treatments. Without warning, 3 black government vehicles pulled up to the curb. Federal agents wearing dark windbreakers walked right through the front glass doors. They ordered every single client to vacate the premises immediately. They ignored Naya's frantic screaming and crying. They slapped bright orange federal seizure notices on the mirrors, the expensive styling chairs, and the front windows. Heavy steel padlocks were chained to the doors. Naya dropped to her knees on the sidewalk outside her own business, clutching her designer bag, weeping uncontrollably as her entire identity was seized by the federal government. Her employees, the people she had been stealing from for 5 years, stood on the corner and watched her empire crumble to dust. Her bank accounts were frozen solid, her credit cards were declined. She was instantly, effectively, and permanently ruined. But I could not forget about my youngest. Malik thought he was clever. After the street syndicate shattered his car windows, he stopped going to his apartment. He started bouncing from couch to couch, crashing at Terrence's house and hiding in the shadows, trying to run out the clock until Friday. He thought if he just kept his head down, the gang would not find him. He forgot that in Atlanta, money talks louder than silence. I made a brief, untraceable phone call to an auto body shop in the West End known to be a front for the syndicate. I did not give my name. I just gave them an address. I told them exactly where Malik was sleeping that night. At 3 in the morning, the nightmare arrived at the doorstep of the house Malik was hiding in. 4 large men stepped out of a dark SUV. They did not knock. They walked right up to the driveway where Malik had parked his already battered luxury sedan. They used heavy steel baseball bats to cave in the roof, smash the headlights, and rip the doors off the hinges. The noise was deafening. When Malik peeked out from behind the living room curtains, trembling in absolute terror, one of the men pointed a baseball bat directly at his face through the window. They left a simple, terrifying message, spray painted in blood-red letters across the hood of the ruined car. Friday or else. In the span of a single week, I had orchestrated a masterpiece of absolute destruction. I sat in my penthouse listening to the intercepted phone calls between my 3 children. It was pure, unfiltered chaos. They were losing their minds. Terrence was pacing his living room, screaming that his career was over and that the FBI was going to arrest him any second. Nia was sobbing hysterically, saying she had no money to even buy groceries because her accounts were locked. Malik was hyperventilating, crying that dead men were walking up to his windows. They were backed against the edge of a cliff with nowhere left to run. And the most poetic part of it all was that they had absolutely no idea I was the one holding the sledgehammer. They blamed bad luck. They blamed corporate spies. They blamed each other. They were turning on themselves, tearing each other to pieces like cornered rats. Their only hope, their single solitary lifeline left in the world, was the $450,000 they were expecting from the fraudulent sale of my house on Friday. They were gripping onto that fake real estate contract like it was a life preserver. They kept telling each other to just hold on for 2 more days, just wait for the cash to clear and everything would be fixed. But they were about to hit a brick wall they never saw coming. Because when you try to sell a property that belongs to a man who is legally tied to a hidden trust fund, the paperwork requires more than just a forged signature. It requires the physical, living, breathing presence of the owner. And they were about to find out that their perfect little scam was missing one vital piece. Me. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, thick humidity that settled over Atlanta like a wet blanket. Inside Terrence's mansion, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. Through the audio surveillance Jackson had planted, I listened as my children paced the hardwood floors. They were waiting for the wire transfer. The fake real estate sale was supposed to close at 9 in the morning. They were staring at their phones, waiting for $450,000 to magically drop into their accounts and wash away their sins. Terrence was biting his fingernails. Nia was drinking vodka before breakfast. Malik was watching the street through the blinds, terrified that the syndicate enforcers were about to pull into the driveway. Chloe was sitting on the edge of the sofa, refreshing her banking app every 10 seconds. At exactly 9:15, Terrence's phone finally rang. It was the title agent handling the closing. The agent was actually a man on Vernon's payroll, playing his part flawlessly. I pressed my headphones tight against my ears to hear the exact moment their fragile world completely shattered. Terrence answered the phone with a desperate, breathless hello. He asked if the funds had been cleared. The agent spoke in a calm, bored, professional voice. He told Terrence there was a major problem with the title transfer. He said the emergency medical power of attorney they had filed was perfectly valid for standard accounts, but it was completely useless for this specific piece of real estate. Terrence started shouting, asking what the hell the agent was talking about. He told him a judge had signed those papers. The agent remained perfectly calm. He explained that back in 1985, Roland Pierce had placed the deed of the house into an archaic, irrevocable family trust. Vernon had intentionally activated this dormant clause days ago. The agent explained that according to the ironclad terms of this specific trust, a medical conservatorship could not force a sale. To release the deed and clear the title, the primary trustee, meaning Roland Pierce, had to physically appear in the room and sign the final release document with live wet ink. No digital signatures, no proxies, no power of attorney. The owner had to look the notary in the eye and sign the paper. The agent told Terrence that the cash was sitting in escrow ready to be released, but without Roland Pierce in the room to sign the final line, the deal was dead. Terrence dropped his phone. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. I listened as pure, absolute panic erupted inside that house. Nia started screaming that she was going to federal prison. Malik grabbed his head and dropped to his knees, crying that the street gang was going to murder him tonight. Chloe started throwing things against the wall, shrieking that her life was ruined. Their brilliant criminal master plan had just hit a brick wall. They had spent thousands of dollars bribing a doctor. They had committed federal perjury in front of a county judge. They had forged documents and stolen my identity. And all of it was completely worthless because they forgot one simple detail. I owned everything. They needed the useless old man they had thrown out into the freezing rain. They needed the father they had legally declared a brain-dead ghost. Suddenly, they realized they had to find me. Terrence yelled at everyone to get their shoes on. He said they had until 5 o'clock when the title office closed to find me, drag me into a room, and make me hold a pen. I sat in my penthouse and laughed. A deep, dark laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. The irony was almost too sweet to bear. A month ago, they looked at me with absolute disgust and told me to get lost because I refused to hand over my money. Now they were running out the door, tearing their hair out, desperately hunting for the exact same man they had thrown away. I was the only oxygen left in their burning room. I listened to Vernon's team report their movements. My children drove their luxury cars through the gritty streets of Atlanta looking for me. They went to homeless shelters downtown. They checked cheap roadside motels. They drove slowly past soup kitchens and under highway overpasses, scanning the faces of the destitute and the forgotten. They assumed that because I was old and cast out by my family, I must be sleeping on a piece of cardboard in an alleyway. They were looking in the gutters because that is exactly where they believed I belonged. By 2 in the afternoon, they were completely hysterical. They had called every union buddy I ever knew. They had checked every diner I used to eat at. Nothing. I was a ghost. I looked at Vernon, who was sitting across from me, sipping a coffee. I told him it was time to drop a crumb. They had suffered enough in the dark. It was time to give them exactly what they were looking for. I picked up my secure phone and made a call to an old friend who ran a plumbing supply store on the south side. A man my kids knew I visited from time to time. I told him that if Terrence called, he should casually mention that he saw me hanging around Martin Luther King Jr. Park looking pretty rough. Then, I went into my expansive walk-in closet. I pushed aside the custom-tailored Italian suits and the expensive leather shoes. I reached into a box at the bottom and pulled out a pair of faded, stained denim jeans, an old flannel shirt with a frayed collar, and a scuffed pair of work boots. I put them on. Then I grabbed a neon orange volunteer safety vest. I looked in the mirror. I did not look like a man who had $25 million sitting in a trust fund. I looked like a broken, exhausted old man who was doing community service just to get a hot meal. Perfect. I took the private elevator down to the garage, but I did not take the Maybach. I had Vernon arrange for an unmarked standard sedan to drop me off 2 blocks away from the park. Martin Luther King Jr. Park was located in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. The basketball courts were cracked with weeds growing through the concrete. The playground equipment was rusted and broken. It was a place the city had forgotten, but I had not forgotten it. I used to play basketball on those exact courts when I was a teenager. And what my children did not know, what nobody but the City Planning Commission knew, was that just 3 days ago, my dummy corporation had quietly wired a $1 million donation to the Parks Department. I had fully funded a massive renovation project to rebuild the entire community center, the courts, and the playground. I owned the future of this park, but to anyone driving by today, I just looked like a janitor. I grabbed a large, heavy push broom from the maintenance shed. I put on my orange safety vest. I walked out onto the cracked concrete of the basketball court and began to slowly sweep the dead leaves and the trash. I hunched my shoulders. I dragged my feet. I played the part of a defeated, broken man who had lost everything. I swept the concrete for 20 minutes before I heard the screeching of tires. A sleek black Porsche pulled up aggressively to the curb, kicking up dust and gravel. The doors flew open. Terrence stepped out, looking frantic, his tie loosened and his expensive shirt wrinkled. Nia jumped out of the back seat, clutching her designer bag. Malik followed close behind, looking over his shoulder like a frightened rabbit. And then came Chloe, her face pale and her eyes wide with desperation. They ran toward the chain-link fence and stopped. They stood there staring at me through the wire mesh. I kept my head down, slowly pushing the broom across the concrete, pretending I did not notice them. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. I knew exactly what they were thinking. They were looking at my stained clothes, my hunched posture, and my bright orange vest. They felt an overwhelming wave of superiority and relief. They thought I had hit rock bottom. They thought the cold, harsh reality of the streets had broken my spirit. They thought I was reduced to sweeping up trash in a forgotten park just to survive. They had absolutely no idea that I could buy their entire lives 10 times over with the spare change in my bank account. They had no idea they were looking at the man who had just orchestrated the systematic destruction of their corporate careers, their fake businesses, and their criminal operations. Dad Terrence called out, his voice cracking with fake emotion. "Dad, is that you?" I stopped sweeping. I leaned heavily on the wooden handle of the push broom, taking a slow, deep breath. I turned my head and looked at them. I made sure my eyes looked tired, hollow, and completely defeated. Terrence pushed open the rusty gate and walked onto the court, followed closely by the others. They were trying to force smiles onto their faces, trying to mask the fact that they were terrified animals, begging for their lives. The trap was fully set. The door was wide open, and my greedy, ungrateful children were walking right inside. It was time to give them the performance of a lifetime. Terrence ran across the cracked concrete of the basketball court. His expensive leather shoes splashed through the muddy puddles, but he did not even care. He threw his arms open and wrapped them around my dirty, sweat-stained shoulders. He pulled me into a tight, desperate hug. "Dad," he cried out, his voice cracking with heavy theatrical emotion. "Oh my God, Dad, we finally found you. We have been looking everywhere for you." We were so worried. Nia was right behind him. She pushed past Terrence and buried her face into my chest. She let out a loud, dramatic sob. "Daddy," she wailed, grabbing handfuls of my faded flannel shirt. "I am so sorry. Look at you. Look at what you have been doing to survive. We were so terrified. We thought we had lost you forever." She pressed her cheek against my chest, making sure I could feel her tears. Malik stood to the side, wiping fake tears from his eyes. He reached out and grabbed my rough, calloused hand, squeezing it tightly. "We have not slept in weeks, old man," he said, trying to sound like a relieved and loving son. "The house has been so empty without you. We need you back." I stood there, leaning heavily on my wooden broom, letting them put on their disgusting little show. The smell of their expensive colognes and perfumes mixed with the cheap dust of the park. If I did not know any better, if I had not heard the audio recordings of them plotting to throw me in a psychiatric ward, I might have actually believed them. Their tears looked incredibly real. Their voices shook with perfect pitch. They were acting like a family who had just found their missing patriarch. But I knew the absolute truth. They were not hugging a father. They were hugging a giant bag of cash. They were hugging their get-out-of-jail-free card. And then came the absolute climax of their pathetic performance. Chloe stepped forward. The woman who had thrown a glass of red wine on my shoes and demanded I be thrown out into the freezing rain was now looking at me with wide, innocent eyes. She had smeared her makeup on purpose to make herself look distraught and exhausted. She slowly lowered herself down onto the dirty, cracked concrete of the basketball court right in front of my scuffed work boots. She actually got on her knees. "Roland," she whimpered, clasping her hands together like she was praying to a saint. "Please forgive me. Please. I was so stressed that night with the housing market and the bills. I lost my temper. I said horrible, cruel things to you. Things I did not mean. You are a good man. You are the foundation of this family. I have been crying every single night since you left. Please come back home with us. Let me make it up to you. I will cook your favorite meals. We will take care of you." I looked down at her kneeling on the dirty ground in her expensive designer jeans. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to laugh so loud it would shake the leaves off the trees. She was a professional internet influencer, and this was the greatest acting job of her entire career. She was begging for my forgiveness, but what she was really begging for was her luxury mansion. She was begging for her maxed-out credit cards and her fake high society life. I kept my face completely blank. I made sure my lower lip trembled just a little bit. I let out a ragged, exhausted sigh, playing the part of the broken, lonely old man perfectly. Terrence put his hands on my shoulders and looked me deep in the eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "We realized how wrong we were. We were blinded by our own ambition. We pushed you away when we should have been pulling you closer. You do not belong out here sweeping the streets like some forgotten outcast. You belong with us. We want to take you home. We want to care for you in your golden years, just like you cared for us when we were kids. We want to be a real family again." I looked past Terrence's shoulder. I noticed something very interesting. Slung across his back was a thick leather messenger bag. He was clutching the strap so tightly his knuckles were turning white. I knew exactly what was sitting inside that bag. It was not an apology letter. It was not a welcome home card. It was a fraudulent real estate contract and a stack of title transfer documents that needed my live signature before 5 o'clock. They did not want to take me home to care for me. They wanted to drag me to a notary, stamp my name on a piece of paper, and then toss me right back onto the street, maybe even drop me off at a state-run mental facility just like they planned at the coffee shop. I looked at Nia and Malik. They were nodding along with Terrence's every word. "We are a family, Dad," Nia said, wiping her nose. "We stick together. We are going to fix everything today. Just come with us right now. We have a car waiting. We can get you cleaned up and get everything sorted out." Malik stepped closer and patted my back. "You will never have to work another day in your life, old man," he promised, his voice shaking with nervous anticipation. "Just get in the car." I let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. I needed them to sweat just a little bit more. I looked down at my rough hands holding the broom. I let my shoulders slump forward, making myself look smaller, weaker, and completely defeated. I forced a single tear to well up in the corner of my eye and let it roll down my weathered cheek. I looked back up at Terrence and gave him a weak, trembling smile. "You really mean that, son?" I asked, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "You really want your old man back? You are not just saying that because you feel guilty." Terrence smiled a massive, relieved smile. His eyes were wide with desperate hope. "Yes, Dad," he said quickly. "Yes, we want you back. Everything is going to be perfect now, I promise you. Just trust us." I slowly nodded. I let go of the broom. It fell to the concrete with a loud clatter. I took off my neon orange safety vest and handed it to Malik. "Okay," I said, sounding like a man who had just surrendered his last ounce of pride. "Okay, take me home. Let us go fix this." I watched a wave of pure, unadulterated euphoria wash over the four of them. They had done it. They thought their master plan had worked flawlessly. They thought they had successfully manipulated a lonely, desperate old man with a few fake tears and a hollow apology. Chloe stood up from the dirty concrete, brushing off her knees, and offered me a sweet, loving smile that hid a mouthful of venom. She reached out and gently rubbed my arm, acting like the perfect, devoted daughter-in-law. Terrence wrapped his arm around me and guided me toward his sleek black Porsche parked on the curb. Nia and Malik followed closely behind, buzzing with nervous energy. They were practically vibrating with excitement. In their minds, the corporate auditors were already paid off. The federal tax liens were already lifted. The street syndicate was already handled. The money was as good as in their bank accounts. They just needed to get me into a room with a pen for 5 minutes and their nightmare would be over forever. I walked slowly, dragging my feet, letting Terrence support my weight. As I sat down in the soft leather seat of his luxury car, I looked out the window at the broken-down park. I had built that park in my mind, and I was about to rebuild my legacy. They thought they were driving me to my financial slaughter. They thought they were the predators, and I was the prey. But as Terrence started the engine and sped away from the curb, I felt a cold, absolute calm settle over me. I was not the prey. I was the architect of their doom. The tearful act was over. The stage was set. And the final curtain was about to fall directly on their heads. They needed my signature to save their lives. But the only thing I was going to sign today was their ultimate destruction. The sleek leather interior of Terrence's Porsche felt cold against my skin. Terrence was speeding, weaving recklessly through the heavy, late-afternoon Atlanta traffic. Malik was in the back seat tapping his foot against the floorboard in a frantic, anxious rhythm. Chloe was sitting in the passenger seat aggressively refreshing her phone screen. Nia was breathing heavily beside me. They had dragged me out of the park and shoved me into the car, promising me a warm bed, a hot meal, and a loving home. But as we drove, they did not take the highway toward Buckhead. Terrence took a sharp, aggressive turn toward downtown. I kept my head down, playing the part of a confused and exhausted old man. "Just a quick stop, Dad," Terrence said, his voice tight and strained. His eyes kept darting to the clock on the dashboard. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. "We need to get some medical subsidy papers signed so we can get you the best care. We found a great notary office that can process the state benefits right now. Just a quick signature, and then we can take you home." I just nodded, letting my head bob weakly with the motion of the car. I did not ask any questions. I knew exactly where we were going. We pulled up to a nondescript gray brick building on a quiet commercial street. A small brass sign on the glass door read, "Notary Public and Legal Services." My children scrambled out of the car like desperate animals. Terrence grabbed my arm, pulling me up from the seat with far more force than a loving son would ever use. They did not know that this office was not a random legal business. It was a front. The building was owned by a shell company managed by my lawyer, Vernon. And the man sitting behind the desk inside, wearing a cheap gray suit, was not just a public notary. He was a retired federal fraud investigator who had been on Vernon's payroll for a decade. Terrence practically dragged me through the glass doors. Chloe held the door open, looking nervously up and down the street. The notary looked up, adjusting his glasses with a perfectly practiced look of boredom. "We have an appointment," Terrence said, sweating profusely. His tailored shirt was sticking to his back. "We need a signature witnessed and officially stamped. We need it done right this second." The notary nodded slowly and pointed to a set of chairs. Terrence did not sit. He opened his thick leather messenger bag and pulled out a stack of crisp white papers. He slammed them down on the heavy wooden desk. "Here, Dad," Terrence said, tapping his finger aggressively on the bottom line of the last page. "Just sign right here. It is for your medical benefits. It will cover your housing and your health care. Just sign it and we can leave." I looked down at the papers. I blinked hard, squinting my eyes and leaning close to the desk as if the text was a blurry, unreadable mess. "My eyes," I whispered, my voice trembling with perfect, fragile vulnerability. "The words are so small, Terrence. Are you sure this is for the hospital?" Chloe let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. The sweet, loving daughter-in-law act cracked for a fraction of a second. "Yes, Roland," she snapped, her voice dripping with venom before she forced a fake, gentle tone back into her throat. "It is for the hospital. Please just sign it. The office closes in 10 minutes and we need to get you home to rest." I picked up the heavy black pen. I let my hand shake violently. The metal tip of the pen tapped rhythmically against the paper. Malik was biting his fingernails, pacing behind me. Nia was shifting her weight from foot to foot, crossing and uncrossing her arms. "Come on, old man," Malik muttered under his breath, unable to hide his panic. I let the pen hover over the dotted line. "You promise you are taking me home after this?" I asked, looking up at Terrence with wide, naive, desperate eyes. "I promise, Dad," Terrence lied, looking right into my soul without a single shred of remorse or hesitation. "I promise." I lowered the pen. I pressed the ink into the paper and slowly, jaggedly wrote my name. Roland Pierce. The very second the pen lifted from the page, the entire atmosphere in the small office violently snapped. It was like a thick, heavy curtain dropping on a stage play. Terrence did not even wait for the ink to dry. He snatched the paper right out from under my hand with ruthless speed. He let out a massive, breathless gasp of absolute relief. Chloe literally jumped in the air, clapping her manicured hands together. Nia let out a loud, triumphant laugh, throwing her head back. Malik leaned heavily against the brick wall, wiping the thick layer of sweat from his forehead. The loving family act was completely turned off, like a light switch. Terrence looked at the signature, then looked down at me. His warm, concerned smile melted away, instantly replaced by a cold, arrogant sneer. "Thank God," he breathed out. He handed the paper to the notary. "Stamp it. Verify it. Now." The notary stamped the document in silence and handed the folder back to Terrence. Terrence shoved it deep into his leather messenger bag and zipped it shut with a loud, satisfying sound. He stood up tall, adjusting his expensive jacket, looking down his nose at me. "All right, Terrence," said his voice completely devoid of any affection. "We are done here." I looked up at him, keeping my shoulders slumped and my hands resting weakly on my knees. "Are we going to your house now, son?" I asked, my voice small and pathetic. Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Home!" she scoffed, looking at me with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You really think you are coming back to our beautiful house? After you made us drive all over this dirty city looking for you like a stray dog, you must really be losing your mind." Terrence did not even flinch at his wife's cruelty. "Look, Dad," he said, crossing his arms. "We got what we needed. I'm going to have an Uber come pick you up in 10 minutes. It will take you to a state-run shelter downtown. They have cots there. They serve hot soup. It is exactly where you belong. Do not call us. Do not come to my house. Do not try to contact my office. We are officially entirely done with you." Nia looked at her perfect nails, not even bothering to make eye contact with me. "Enjoy the shelter, Dad," she said coldly. "Thanks for the bailout." Malik did not say a single word. He just turned his back and walked out the glass door, eager to call the street syndicate and tell them his money was secured. They walked out of the office, leaving me sitting alone in the wooden chair. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them. I watched through the large front window as they high-fived each other on the sidewalk. Terrence grabbed Chloe and kissed her, celebrating their massive victory. They got into the sleek black Porsche, the engine roaring to life, and sped off into the late afternoon traffic. They thought they had just secured $450,000. They thought they had just finalized the sale of my home and successfully cast me out into the gutter. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. Once the car turned the corner and disappeared from sight, I stopped, slumping my shoulders. I sat up perfectly straight. I rolled my neck, feeling the tight tension release from my muscles. The frail, confused old man vanished into thin air. I looked over at the notary. He took off his reading glasses, let out a long breath, and smiled. "Brilliant performance, Mr. Pierce," the investigator said, leaning back in his chair. I smiled back, a cold, sharp grin. "Did he read it?" I asked. "Not a single word," the investigator laughed, shaking his head. "He was so frantic to get that signature, he just looked at the dotted line. He did not even check the headers. They thought I had just signed the title release for my house." But what Terrence had pulled out of his leather bag and slammed on the desk was not the original real estate contract. When we first walked into the office, Terrence had handed the folder to the notary to verify the pages. In that brief 5-second window, my investigator had flawlessly swapped the internal documents. The paper I had just signed, and the paper that Terrence, Chloe, Nia, and Malik had all eagerly co-signed as official witnesses to finalize the deal, was not a real estate transfer. It was a highly detailed, legally binding sworn affidavit prepared by Vernon. It was a complete federal confession. By signing it as my emergency conservators and witnesses, they had just legally sworn under penalty of federal perjury that they had forged medical documents, committed identity theft, and attempted to sell a property they did not possess the legal right to sell. They had literally walked into a federal honey trap, signed their own arrest warrants, and carried the evidence out in their own leather bag. They were driving away, celebrating their genius, completely unaware that the heavy folder in Terrence's bag was a ticking time bomb. I stood up, smoothing out the wrinkles in my dirty flannel shirt. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed. "Vernon is private number. It is done," I said, my voice low and steady. They took the bait and swallowed the hook. "Prepare the invitations. It is time for the final act." I sat in the dark luxury of my penthouse, listening to the crystal-clear audio feed streaming from Terrence's living room. The sound of clinking glass echoed through my headphones. My children were celebrating. They had managed to buy a cheap bottle of sparkling wine from the corner liquor store, probably using the loose change they found in their couch cushions. They were toasting to their own brilliance. Terrence was boasting loudly about how incredibly easy it was to break me. He laughed a deep, arrogant laugh, telling Nia and Malik about the pathetic look on my face when I held the pen. He called me a completely useless old fool. He said I was probably standing in the freezing rain right now, waiting in line at a downtown soup kitchen, crying over a bowl of watery broth. Nia chimed in, her voice dripping with absolute superiority. She said she could not wait for Monday morning when the escrow funds would finally clear the bank. She was already planning how she would walk into the federal building and throw a cashier check right in the face of the IRS agents who locked up her salon. Malik was pacing the room, his voice buzzing with chaotic energy. He kept muttering about how he was going to drop a heavy duffel bag of pure cash right on the street syndicate boss's desk and tell the gang to back off forever. They were entirely drunk on their own fake victory. They honestly believed they had beaten the system. They believed they had successfully sacrificed their father to save their own miserable lives. But their massive celebration had one giant, glaring flaw. It was only Friday night. The fraudulent money they thought they secured would not even begin processing until the banks opened on Monday. And the wolves were already scratching at their doors right now. The corporate auditors were still hovering over Terrence's neck. The IRS locks were still firmly chained to Nia's doors. And the violent street gang had explicitly promised Malik that Friday night was his absolute final deadline. They needed cold, hard cash to survive the weekend, and they had absolutely zero liquidity. As the cheap wine quickly ran out, the harsh reality of the weekend gap started to creep into their conversation. The arrogant laughter faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. Malik started hyperventilating, his breathing coming in sharp, jagged gasps. He told his siblings the gang would not wait until Monday morning. He said the enforcers did not care about pending real estate transfers. He said they were going to kick his door down and shoot him in his sleep tonight. Terrence started pacing heavily, his expensive shoes slapping against the hardwood floor. He was sweating through his shirt, realizing his company board members might just call the FBI on Sunday night to get ahead of the news cycle. They were rich in their wild delusions, but completely, totally bankrupt in reality. That was the exact moment I decided to throw them a lifeline made entirely of barbed wire. I picked up my phone and gave Vernon the green light. A heavy, aggressive knock on Terrence's front door made them all jump in absolute terror. Through the audio feed, I heard Malik let out a pathetic whimper, genuinely believing the street enforcers had finally arrived to collect his blood. Terrence told everyone to be quiet. He slowly walked to the front door and opened it just a crack. It was not a hitman. It was a private luxury courier wearing a crisp black uniform and white gloves. The courier handed Terrence 4 thick, heavy envelopes sealed with golden wax, and then turned around and walked away without a word. Terrence brought the envelopes into the living room, his hands shaking as he tore his open. I listened closely as he read the heavy cardstock aloud to the room. It was a highly exclusive VIP invitation to the most important high society gala of the year, taking place tonight at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in downtown Atlanta. The event was the official grand launch of a massive multi-million-dollar real estate development that was taking over the entire downtown warehouse district. The project was boldly titled The Pierce Legacy. The invitation stated that the event was hosted by the anonymous billionaire who had just bought up the entire city block. None of my children made the connection. Pierce is a common enough last name, and their blinding arrogance prevented them from even entertaining the impossible idea that their useless plumber father could be involved in a corporate empire. Instead of feeling suspicion, they felt pure, unadulterated greed. Chloe snatched the golden invitation right out of Terrence's hand. Her voice pitched up in absolute manic desperation and excitement. She told everyone in the room that this was their ultimate salvation. She said the Ritz-Carlton ballroom would be packed wall to wall with investment bankers, venture capitalists, and real estate tycoons. She told Malik this was his chance to find a private wealthy lender who could front him the street money he needed to survive the weekend. She told Nia she could easily network and find a silent partner to bail out her failing salon business. And Chloe looked right at Terrence and told him he could charm his way into a brand new executive job before the FBI even knew his name. Chloe convinced them that this gala was their golden ticket out of hell. She said all they had to do was show up, rub elbows with the elite, and secure a few simple bridge loans to float them until my house money arrived in their accounts on Monday. But there was a massive problem. To hunt billionaires, you have to actually look like a billionaire. And my children were completely flat broke. Chloe demanded they pool every single resource they had left to their names. I sat in my penthouse and listened as my supposedly successful children scrambled like desperate, starving scavengers. Nia went into her purse and pulled out her last authentic designer watch, crying as she agreed to pawn it at a massive loss. Terrence emptied the hidden coin jars in his closet and desperately called a former coworker begging for a $200 emergency cash transfer. They took the absolute last pennies they could scrape together in the world. They did not use that money to buy food. They did not use it to secure a safe hotel room for Malik to hide from the gang. They took their very last dollars and ran to a discount formal wear shop. They rented cheap, ill-fitting tuxedos and a clearance rack evening gown that only looked expensive if you stood far away in dim lighting. They spent 2 hours painting on their fake, confident smiles, spraying on their designer perfumes, and practicing their networking pitches in the mirror. They were preparing to walk into the Ritz-Carlton, pretending to be high society royalty. They thought they were going to completely manipulate the rich elite of Atlanta and secure the cash they desperately needed. They had absolutely no idea that the anonymous billionaire hosting the gala tonight was the exact same man they had just left sitting in a dirty flannel shirt at a fake notary office hours ago. They had no idea they were walking directly into the grand finale of my plan. The final trap was completely set. My children were fixing their bow ties and zipping up their dresses, completely unaware that they were getting dressed up for their own public funeral. The grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel was a masterpiece of absolute luxury. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over the room. There were massive ice sculptures, towers of imported champagne, and tables covered in fine silk. The room was packed with the true elite of Atlanta. There were real estate tycoons, venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and bank presidents. These were men and women who possessed the kind of wealth that does not need to shout. They wore bespoke suits that cost more than a luxury car. They spoke in quiet, confident tones. I stood on the private mezzanine balcony overlooking the entire ballroom, hidden completely in the shadows. I looked down at the sea of power and wealth waiting patiently for my guests of honor to arrive. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom opened and they walked in. Terrence, Chloe, Nia, and Malik stepped into the glittering room. I watched them from above, and I almost felt a twinge of pity before the cold reality of their crimes hardened my heart again. They were trying so desperately to look like they belonged, but they stuck out like sore thumbs. Terrence was wearing a rented tuxedo that was too tight in the shoulders and too short in the sleeves. Nia had squeezed herself into a cheap sequined gown she probably bought off a clearance rack that afternoon. Malik looked like a nervous teenager going to his first school dance, sweating profusely in a cheap suit. Chloe tried to walk with her nose high in the air, but her dress lacked the elegant structure of the women standing around her. They grabbed glasses of free champagne from a passing waiter and huddled together near the entrance. They looked like 4 starving wolves looking at a flock of sheep, but they did not realize that they were not the wolves tonight. They were the sheep, and they had just walked into a slaughterhouse. They had one simple, desperate mission. They needed to secure a short-term bridge loan to float them until the fraudulent money from my house cleared on Monday. They needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to hold off the corporate auditors, the federal tax agents, and the violent street syndicate. They nodded to each other, plastered fake, confident smiles on their faces, and split up to work the room. I watched Terrence zero in on a group of senior investment bankers. These were men who controlled billions of dollars. Terrence puffed out his chest, holding his cheap glass of champagne, and inserted himself into their circle. He started talking using all the corporate buzzwords he had learned as a sales director. He tried to pitch them on a short-term, high-yield investment opportunity. He was practically begging them for a personal loan disguised as a business deal. But word travels incredibly fast in the high-stakes corporate world of Atlanta. Those bankers already knew about the missing $300,000 from the medical supply company. They knew Terrence was a dead man walking. I watched the lead banker look Terrence up and down with an expression of pure, polite disgust. The banker did not even let Terrence finish his sentence. He simply turned his back and engaged the man next to him, completely freezing Terrence out of the circle. Terrence stood there, his face burning red with absolute humiliation. Nia was not doing any better on the other side of the room. She cornered a wealthy commercial real estate developer. She tried to use her charm, batting her eyelashes and talking about her massive beauty salon empire. She asked him for a quick capital injection to expand her business, promising huge returns by next week. The developer looked at her cheap dress and her desperate eyes. Rich men can smell desperation from a mile away. He politely excused himself, claiming he needed to speak with the caterer, and walked away without even asking for her name. Nia was left standing alone near a towering ice sculpture, gripping her champagne glass so tightly I thought it might shatter in her hand. Malik was the worst of them all. His life was actively being threatened by a ruthless street gang, and his panic was completely uncontrollable. He was sweating through his cheap rented suit. I watched him approach a group of tech investors. He did not even bother to make small talk. He just started frantically asking if anyone offered emergency cash advances for crypto portfolios. He sounded like a madman. The investors looked at him like he was a dangerous lunatic who had somehow sneaked past hotel security. One of them actually signaled a nearby security guard to keep a close eye on Malik. He was completely out of his mind with fear. After 45 minutes of brutal, humiliating rejection, the four of them retreated to a dark corner near the service doors. I watched them huddled together from my balcony. Their fake smiles were completely gone. The reality of their catastrophic situation was finally sinking in. Nobody in this room was going to give them a single dime. The rich elite of Atlanta saw right through their cheap rented clothes and their desperate sweaty pitches. They realized they were not going to secure the money they needed to survive the weekend. Chloe was whispering furiously at Terrence, her face twisted in anger, pointing her finger at his chest. Terrence was shaking his head, looking down at the floor, completely defeated. Nia looked like she was about to burst into tears. Malik was holding his stomach, looking like he was going to be sick right there on the expensive carpet. Their golden ticket had turned into a total nightmare. They were surrounded by millions of dollars, and they could not touch a single penny. They were completely, utterly bankrupt. Then the ambient music in the ballroom softly faded into silence. The bright crystal chandeliers dimmed, lowering the room into a dramatic, hushed darkness. The low hum of conversation from the hundreds of elite guests faded away as all attention turned toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. I stepped back deeper into the shadows of my balcony, fixing the cuffs of my custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. The time had finally arrived. A polished master of ceremonies stepped up to the crystal podium. He tapped the microphone, and the sound echoed perfectly through the massive space. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich and commanding, "we welcome you to this historic evening. Tonight we are not just celebrating a new development, we are celebrating the absolute transformation of the downtown Atlanta warehouse district." The crowd murmured in polite agreement, holding their glasses. Terrence, Chloe, Nia, and Malik stopped their furious arguing and looked toward the stage, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was about to fall on their heads. The master of ceremonies continued speaking, his voice rising with theatrical excitement. For months, the business world has speculated about the anonymous buyer who acquired the entire downtown block in a single historic $25 million cash transaction. Today, the mystery finally ends. The visionary behind the magnificent Pierce Legacy project is a man who built his empire from the ground up with his own bare hands through decades of quiet, relentless hard work. I watched my children standing in the dark corner. They still did not make the connection. They were too blind, too arrogant, and too desperate to even imagine the truth. The master of ceremonies raised his hand, pointing toward the massive, heavy mahogany double doors at the far end of the ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please raise your glasses and join me in welcoming the sole owner, the chairman, and the visionary of the Pierce Legacy." The crowd erupted into massive applause. Hundreds of the most powerful people in Atlanta turned their bodies toward the grand entrance. A single blinding white spotlight cut through the dark ballroom, illuminating the heavy mahogany doors. The dramatic music swelled, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of power and anticipation. The heavy brass handles began to turn. The massive doors slowly started to swing open. The spotlight shined brightly, waiting to reveal the $25 million billionaire to the world. And my children, standing in their cheap rented clothes, looked toward the light, completely unprepared for the face they were about to see. The heavy brass handles of the massive mahogany doors clicked and began to turn. It felt as if time had slowed down to a complete crawl. For 40 years, I had walked through the service entrances of luxury buildings exactly like this one. I had carried heavy metal toolboxes through the cold back alleys, sweating through my stained work shirts just to fix the busted pipes of the wealthy elites who were standing in this very room. I had spent my entire life in the background, covered in grease and dust so that my children could walk in the light. But tonight I was not using the service elevator. Tonight the main doors were opening specifically for me. The bright, blinding white spotlight cut through the darkness of the ballroom and landed perfectly on the grand entrance. The dramatic orchestral music swelled to a magnificent heavy crescendo echoing off the high crystal ceilings. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I felt the weight of my 70 years, but it was not the weight of a broken, exhausted old man. It was the weight of a king stepping up to finally claim his throne. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the blinding center of the spotlight. I was not wearing a stained flannel shirt. I was not holding a dirty push broom. I was wearing a bespoke jet black Tom Ford suit that had been custom tailored to fit every single inch of my frame perfectly. My shoes were handcrafted, polished Italian leather that shined under the chandelier lights. In my right hand, I gripped a heavy mahogany walking cane topped with a solid gold handle. I did not need the cane to walk, but I carried it as a pure symbol of absolute, unyielding power. Walking exactly one step behind me was Vernon wearing a sharp charcoal suit. Flanking us were three of the most ruthless and expensive corporate lawyers in the entire city of Atlanta. They walked with their shoulders squared and their heads held high. We did not look like a simple legal team. We looked like a corporate execution squad marching toward a firing squad. The entire ballroom erupted into deafening applause. Hundreds of millionaires, venture capitalists, and real estate tycoons stood on their feet, clapping and cheering for the mysterious man who had just bought the entire downtown warehouse district for $25 million in pure cash. The sound was overwhelming. It was a massive tidal wave of pure absolute respect. I kept my head held high, my face chiseled out of stone, and my eyes locked onto the far dark corner of the room near the service doors. Through the blinding lights and the sea of clapping hands, I found them. My 3 children and my beautiful fake daughter-in-law. They were standing exactly where I had watched them huddled together in their cheap, rented formal wear. I watched the exact millisecond my true identity registered in their panicked brains. It was the most beautiful, devastating thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Chloe was holding a delicate crystal flute of champagne. As her eyes focused on my face as she realized that the anonymous billionaire hosting this magnificent gala was the exact same useless old man she had thrown out into the freezing rain, her fingers completely gave out. The expensive crystal glass slipped from her hand and plummeted to the hard marble floor. It shattered into 100 jagged pieces, splashing champagne across her cheap shoes. The sharp crashing sound cut through the air around her, but she did not even flinch. Chloe stopped breathing. Her mouth hung wide open, and the fake high society mask she had worn her entire life completely melted off her face, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated terror. Terrence was standing right next to her. The golden boy. The corporate embezzler who had violently dragged me to a fake notary office just hours ago. He looked like he had been struck directly in the chest by a bolt of lightning. The blood drained from his face so fast his skin turned an ashen, ghostly gray. His knees literally buckled beneath him, causing him to stumble forward and grab onto a tall cocktail table just to keep from collapsing onto the floor. His eyes were bulging out of his skull. He looked at my custom-tailored suit. He looked at the gold-tipped cane. He looked at Vernon standing behind me with a cold, knowing smirk. In that one single, agonizing moment, every single puzzle piece snapped together in his mind. He realized the forged medical evaluation, the rushed real estate contract, the delayed escrow funds, all of it was an elaborate trap. He realized he was not the brilliant hunter he thought he was. He had been the helpless prey all along. Nia slapped both of her hands over her mouth, letting out a muffled, terrified gasp. Her cheap sequined dress seemed to swallow her whole as she shrank back against the wall. She was shaking violently, vibrating with the horrific realization that the father she had called a useless burden was the very man who could have saved her from the federal tax agents who locked up her salons. She saw the immense wealth radiating from me and realized she had thrown away her only salvation for absolutely nothing. And Malik. My youngest son looked like a dead man walking. He was sweating so profusely his rented collar was completely soaked. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, realizing that the old man he had told to get lost was a financial titan who could have paid off his violent street debt with the spare change in his pocket. He was completely paralyzed. His mind simply broke under the crushing weight of his own catastrophic stupidity. I began my walk toward the main stage. The sea of the Atlanta elite parted for me like the Red Sea. Powerful men bowed their heads in respect as I passed. Wealthy women smiled and applauded loudly. I did not stop to shake hands. I walked with a slow, rhythmic, menacing pace. The solid gold tip of my cane tapped against the polished marble floor with a heavy, sharp thud. Every single step I took was a nail being hammered directly into the coffin of my children's fake empire. I walked right past the senior investment bankers who had just rejected Terrence in disgust. I walked past the commercial developers who had completely ignored Nia. I walked right past the tech investors who had looked at Malik like he was a dangerous lunatic. These incredibly powerful people were bowing to me. They were clapping for me. And my children had to stand shivering in the dark corner and watch the entire city worship the father they had treated like human garbage. I reached the carpeted stairs leading up to the crystal podium. Vernon stepped forward and respectfully offered his hand, but I waved him off. I walked up the steps on my own, projecting absolute strength and total control. I stepped up to the microphone. The master of ceremonies backed away quickly, giving me the entire stage. The massive ballroom slowly fell into a deep, respectful silence. You could hear a pin drop in that room. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were locked onto me, waiting for my grand speech. But I did not look at the billionaire investors. I did not look at the bankers. I looked directly across the massive room, straight into the shadows of the far corner. My gaze locked onto Terrence, Nia, Malik, and Chloe. My eyes were as cold and sharp as razor blades. I stared at them with a heavy, unyielding intensity that pinned them to the wall like insects. I let the silence stretch out, letting them suffocate in the agonizing tension of the moment. They were trapped. They could not run. They could not hide. They had to stand there in their cheap rented clothes, completely bankrupt, utterly destroyed, and look up at the father they had tried to bury alive. I leaned into the microphone. The sound of my slow, heavy breathing echoed through the massive speakers overhead. They were waiting for me to speak. They were waiting for the executioner to drop the heavy axe, and I was going to give them a public execution they would never, ever forget. I stood at the crystal podium looking out over the sea of wealthy faces. The silence in the ballroom was heavy and thick. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. Anger is for the weak, and I was no longer weak. I tapped the microphone once and leaned forward. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady and low, echoing through the massive room. "For 40 years I worked in the shadows of this city. I fixed the pipes under your homes, and I breathed the dust of your basements. I built my wealth quietly because true power does not need to boast. But tonight, we are talking about legacy." I looked directly into the dark corner where Terrence, Chloe, Naya, and Malik were standing frozen in their cheap rented clothes. They were holding their breath, waiting for me to acknowledge them. They were waiting for me to publicly claim them as my heirs and save them from the destruction they brought upon themselves. But that was not going to happen. I told the crowd that a man's legacy is not measured by the blood in his veins. It is measured by the character of the people he leaves behind. I kept my eyes locked on my children as I continued to speak. I told the audience that I recently sold a block of properties for $25 million. The crowd murmured in respectful awe, but I raised my hand to silence them. I said many people expected me to pass this fortune down to my children. I said society expects us to hand our hard-earned wealth to the next generation so they can live comfortably. But I have learned a very harsh lesson about comfort. Comfort without struggle breeds pure entitlement. Giving millions of dollars to people who have never respected the value of a single honest dollar does not build a legacy. It only creates monsters. Terrence was shaking his head slowly, his eyes wide with a growing, horrified realization. Chloe was grabbing her hair. Nia was weeping silently. Malik looked like he was about to faint. I leaned closer to the microphone. Therefore, I announced I am not leaving a single penny of my $25 million estate to my family. The entire room gasped. The wealthy elite stared at me in absolute shock. I continued speaking, my voice cutting through the whispers. Instead, I have established the Vivian Pierce Memorial Foundation, named after my late beautiful wife. As of this morning, the entire $25 million has been legally and irrevocably transferred into a trust fund. This fund is dedicated entirely to providing full-ride college scholarships for underprivileged black students across the city of Atlanta. I am giving my wealth to young men and women who actually know what it means to struggle. I am giving it to kids who will use this money to build their communities instead of tearing them down. The ballroom erupted. Hundreds of people stood up clapping and cheering wildly. The applause was deafening. It was a massive wave of pure respect. But in the back corner, my children were completely destroyed. The realization that the money was gone forever, permanently locked away in an irrevocable charity fund, finally broke Terrence. His brain simply snapped. The desperate corporate embezzler could not handle the fact that his final lifeline had just evaporated into thin air. He let out a primal, furious scream that cut through the applause. He shoved past a wealthy investor, knocking a tray of champagne glasses out of a waiter's hands. "You cannot do this!" Terrence roared, his face red and twisted with rage as he charged across the marble floor toward the main stage. "That is our money." Or, "You owe us that money, you crazy old man!" The elite crowd backed away in shock and disgust as this sweaty, desperate man in a cheap tuxedo disrupted the elegant gala. Chloe tried to run after him, screaming his name, but she tripped over her clearance rack gown and fell to the floor. Terrence reached the bottom of the stairs, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are sick in the head," he shouted, letting his true evil colors show in front of the entire city. "I have the medical papers. You are legally incompetent. I own your estate. I am going to have you locked in an asylum, and I am taking every single dime back." I did not move a single inch. I looked down at my furious son with absolute cold pity. I did not need to say a word, because Vernon stepped forward and gave a simple, slight nod toward the heavy curtains on the side of the stage. The curtains pushed open. Two large men wearing dark suits and federal badges clipped to their belts stepped out into the bright light. They were not local hotel security. They were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They walked down the stairs with swift, terrifying precision. One agent grabbed Terrence by the shoulder and slammed him hard against the side of the stage, pulling his arms behind his back. The loud, harsh, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the front of the ballroom. Terrence screamed in confusion, struggling against the federal agent. "What are you doing?" he yelled, thrashing his body like a wild animal. "I am his legal guardian. I have the power of attorney. Let me go." The lead agent pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was not a fake medical document. It was a federal arrest warrant. Terrence Pierce, the agent said in a loud, booming voice that the entire room could hear perfectly. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal real estate wire fraud, identity theft, and the extensive forgery of federal medical documents." The agent turned and pointed toward the back of the room where Nia, Malik, and Chloe were trying to slip out the service doors. "Stop right there," the agent commanded. 3 more FBI agents rushed in from the lobby, completely blocking the exits. The trap had snapped shut and there was nowhere left to run. They grabbed Nia and pushed her against the wall. She screamed about her salon, crying that she was an innocent business owner. They tackled Malik to the carpet as he tried to run for his life. He was sobbing uncontrollably, crying that the street gang was going to kill him if he went to prison. They grabbed Chloe by her arms and pulled her up from the floor. She kicked and shrieked, begging them not to ruin her image. She was crying that her designer shoes were being stepped on. The flashing lights of dozens of press cameras erupted, illuminating the entire ballroom. The financial journalists who had come to cover a massive real estate launch were now frantically photographing the spectacular criminal downfall of my family. The rich elites of Atlanta stood in silent horror, watching these 4 frauds get dragged away in handcuffs. Terrence looked up at me from the floor, tears of absolute panic streaming down his face. "Dad, please tell them it is a mistake," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "Tell them I am your conservator. Tell them I own the house." I looked down at him and leaned into the microphone so my voice would carry over the beautiful chaos of their arrests. "There is no mistake, Terrence," I said calmly, looking right into his terrified eyes. "That paper you forced me to sign at the notary office yesterday, the one you shoved in my face, the one you told me was just for medical benefits, the one you thought gave you the ultimate right to sell my house and throw me on the street. You were so desperate for cash you never bothered to read the fine print." Terrence stopped struggling. He stared at me, his breathing completely frozen. "It was a sworn federal affidavit." I continued, my voice ringing with absolute finality. When you and your wife and your siblings signed it as official witnesses, you legally confessed under penalty of perjury to every single crime you planned against me. You handed the FBI your own written confessions in a leather bag. The blood completely drained from Terrence's face. The arrogant golden boy finally realized he had built his own prison and personally locked the door from the inside. The room was filled with the sound of cameras clicking and my children crying as the federal agents dragged them out of the ballroom. I stood at the crystal podium watching them disappear into the night, feeling nothing but the cold, hard peace of absolute justice. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles bounced off the crystal glass of the Ritz-Carlton lobby. I stood at the top of the grand marble staircase watching the final act of the play I had orchestrated. 2 federal agents grabbed Terrence by the shoulders and shoved him into the back of a heavy armored transport van. His rented tuxedo jacket was torn. His face was stained with sweat and tears. He kept looking back up at me, begging silently, but my face remained carved out of solid stone. Chloe was next. She was fighting the female agents, kicking her cheap heels against the pavement, crying about her social media accounts and her reputation. They pushed her into the dark metal cage of the van right next to her husband. Nia walked out with her head completely down, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick black lines. She knew her beauty empire was gone forever, and federal prison was waiting. Malik was shaking so violently the agents had to practically carry him. Ironically, the back of that federal transport van was the safest place Malik could possibly be. The street syndicate could not reach him inside a federal penitentiary. The heavy steel doors of the van slammed shut with a loud, echoing boom that signaled the absolute end of their lives. The engines roared, and the convoy pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the dark Atlanta night. I stood there watching the taillights fade away. For 40 years I had carried the weight of my children on my back. I had sacrificed my youth, my knees, and my dreams to give them a perfect life. I thought losing them would break my heart. But as I watched them get hauled away to federal prison, I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were completely dry. My chest felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating burden of their greed and entitlement was finally lifted off my shoulders. I was free. I turned around and walked down the private hallway to the underground garage. Vernon was waiting for me by the open door of the black Maybach. He gave me a silent nod of absolute respect. We did not say a word on the ride back. There was nothing left to say. The war was over. The enemy had been completely eradicated. The private elevator chimed as the doors opened into my penthouse. The massive space was quiet and peaceful. The city lights of Atlanta shined brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I took off my suit jacket and draped it over the back of a leather chair. I loosened my tie and took a long, slow breath. I walked over to the heavy mahogany bar in the corner of the living room. I reached for my favorite bottle of aged Kentucky bourbon. I poured a generous splash into a heavy crystal glass, listening to the rich sound of the liquid hitting the bottom. I carried the glass over to the marble fireplace. Sitting right in the center of the mantel was a silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Vivian. She looked so beautiful in that picture. She was smiling, her eyes full of the pure, innocent love we shared when we were young and building our life together from scratch. I stood in front of her picture and raised my glass. I told her I was sorry it had to end this way. I told her I tried to give them the world, but the world ended up poisoning their souls. I promised her I would take the empire we built and use it to help kids who actually deserved a chance. Kids who knew the value of hard work. I promised her our legacy would survive, but it would be built on respect and honor, not greed and manipulation. I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I set the glass down gently, right next to her photograph. The house was completely silent, and for the first time in a very long time I felt true absolute peace. Blood makes you related, but respect and loyalty make you family. When children view their parents not as human beings who sacrificed for them, but as automated teller machines meant to fund their greed, they sever the very roots that sustain them. Never mistake a parent is quiet humility for weakness. True wealth is not inherited through manipulation. It is built through integrity. In the end, those who treat love as a transaction will always find themselves bankrupt, standing empty-handed in the shadow of the bridges they burned. You reap exactly the cruelty you sow. If you enjoyed this story, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more life stories like this one. Thank you for listening, and remember to always protect your peace.